Welcome to The Other Side of Medicine, a trusted source for education, not medication, for 35 years. In every episode of The Other Side of Medicine, we deliver health information your doctor won't tell you about. My guests are the nation's leading health experts in science-based natural medicine, physicians, authors, researchers, and clinicians. We believe natural medicine should be first, drugs and surgery last, and so we promise to deliver you the next generation of health information built on three principles: common sense, science, and cooperation with nature. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Other Side of Medicine. I am Dr. Krystosik. You can call me Dr. J, and today we are excited to have a special guest with us. His name is Lance Leonard. He is the CEO of New Phoenix Rising, a company that sells an amazing superfood called spirulina. So we're going to dive deeply in today. This is actually part 2 of a series that we're doing here on spirulina with Lance. And before we kind of get to meet Lance again, I really want to just give you a little bit about who I am, what I do, and what I would really like for you. So again, I am a functional medicine physician, a nutritionist. I'm an author of 7 books on natural medicine, and I have a passion to help people to live independently healthy. I've helped over 20,000 people to be able to accomplish that, alleviating chronic disease. And I've used spirulina over the years, not only personally, but I have prescribed it to my patients because it is a powerful superfood. It's been used for thousands of years, everyone from the Aztecs to the astronauts. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive into this topic tonight. But spirulina is something that I feel has great value because it's one of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. And again, as I mentioned, NASA has used spirulina for taking up into space because they don't have a lot of room in those rockets for the food supply. So it's a very nutrient-dense food. As a matter of fact, NASA said that spirulina has 1 kilogram is equal to 1,000 kilograms of fruits and vegetables. That is absolutely mind-boggling, my friends. And so spirulina is something that I think that everybody on the planet should be using. It's really been studied by a lot of scientists to help with world hunger. We'll talk a little bit about that. But it's loaded with nutrition, including 60% protein by weight. And it has beta-carotene. It's got a lot of all the amino acids, which not too many foods that are in the plant kingdom have all the amino acids in them. And it also is loaded with a lot of different minerals, and it is significantly rich in antioxidant compounds, one of which we'll talk about today is called phycocyanin, and it has many other compounds, but we'll talk about that one in particular because that is really raising eyebrows in the scientific community. And so spirulina has many medicinal properties. You know, I always talk about how food is the best medicine, and this food is a prime example of how food is your best medicine. It's anti-inflammatory. It's able to help to reduce cholesterol and triglycerides. It's been shown in research to help to lower blood pressure and lower blood sugar levels. So it's got many, many properties that will really help to complement what you're doing with diet and lifestyle modifications. I want to introduce you to our special guest here this afternoon, and his name is Lance Leonard. Lance, a very interesting character. He has studied nutrition, personally trained, and studied with some very, very well-known authors and leaders in the field of nutrition since 1975, along with his wife, Lindia. And they live in California. And they have actually, as I mentioned earlier, the CEO of the new Phoenix Rising Spirulina company. But Lance is also an author of many articles on nutrition and motivational speaking. He's also studied with Jeffrey Smith, a world-renowned leader in genetically modified foods and the dangers of those. And so he studied with him personally. And he's also been working with world-class scientists on spirulina and other nutritional foods that are really beneficial to help to prevent disease and optimize health. So I just really want to give a warm welcome to this gentleman who I think you'll find quite interesting. Lance, welcome to the Other Side of Medicine.
Thank you, Dr. J. I'm delighted to be here again and in your company and presence. And I know that you've done so much for so many people for so many years. It's fun to meet a kindred spirit. And
yeah. Well, I tell you what, I think our audience is in store for a really, really great treat tonight. Our part one, we really dove into a lot of the benefits of spirulina. And I encourage you, if you didn't listen to part one, to go back on the internet. We'll put a link to it with this video, but you should really listen to part one too, because there's so many pearls of wisdom that Lance shared with us, as well as some of the things that I brought into the picture. And so, Lance, give us a little glimpse of what we'd like to talk about tonight.
Well, there are so many things that spirulina helps with. And, it's important to understand it's not a magic bullet or magic pill, but at the same time, it does so many things. It almost seems like that. So we're going to talk about some of those things specifically, but I wanted to lead off with talking about the immune qualities of it, because I think in this day and age, they're so important. And of course, this season of the year, that's important too. So many things are affected when our immune system is weakened or when it's strong. On the other hand, we have a much better time dealing with whatever comes our way. And we're all dealing with toxins in our world today, whether it's in our food, in the air, in the soil, in the water. There's just so many ways. I mean, even electromagnetic pollution, there's all kinds of toxins. And so when we have a strong immune system, we can fight those things off. That's what our body naturally does. But when our immune system is weakened, either because it's not getting the right nutrients or because we're too stressed, and of course, these things can become a cycle. You can not have the right nutrients, which creates stress, and then you feel stressed, and then you have more stress, and then your stress leads to even worse outcomes, as I'm sure you know.
Give us some of the salient points about how spirulina helps to boost the immune system.
Well, there's a lot of science on it, as you said, and so I'm going to give you some high points here. But one of the key things in spirulina is the phycocyanin. Phycocyanin, we mentioned it in our last talk, but we'll go a little deeper into it this time. Phycocyanin is the blue pigment in spirulina. That's why they used to call it a blue-green algae. We've been doing this long enough that they've changed how they categorize cyanobacteria. Spirulina hasn't changed, but the name is now different. But the point is that this blue pigment, which back when spirulina was first really starting to be researched, they didn't even understand that was a thing, or much less that it was important. We have a United Nations chemical analysis. They call it typical chemical analysis, meaning it's just some spirulina that they analyzed. And they don't even list phycocyanin in that listing. They list everything they thought was important. Well, nowadays, we know more, and we're becoming more and more knowledgeable all the time. People all over the world, whether it's Asia, Europe, the United States, Mexico, they're studying especially. It's not the only great thing in spirulina, but it is one of the most unique things about spirulina. And that phycocyanin is an antioxidant, which of course we know now that cell death has to do with oxidation. We know that aging is connected to oxidation. So antioxidants are very important. You might have heard people say, "Oh, eat blueberries. They're high in antioxidants." Well, that's true. There are many foods that have antioxidants. In fact, you see in the foods are an indicator of antioxidants of various kinds. Each of them do different things. The blue one, the one in spirulina, which isn't the same as what's in blueberries, by the way, is very, very powerful. And so besides being an antioxidant, it's also anti-inflammatory. So, there's a lot of ways that this works with other compounds that are already in the spirulina. But the main thing is that when it's anti-inflammatory, one of the things that's been studied is it stops the cytokine reaction that happens. And so
just for our listening audience benefit, cytokines are inflammatory compounds that we can actually, as doctors, test in the blood. And so that is something that spirulina, you're saying, is able to reduce those cytokines.
Yeah. In fact, they've studied it with viruses and had amazing results, and including a big virus that everybody's heard of. There's been some studies coming out about that too. Some amazing work that we can, if you want to link to, you can. It's public. It's on the internet. You can find it.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. We won't, mention any names because, we don't want anybody to misconstrue what we're saying. But when you're talking about that particular virus, what have the scientists found?
Well, the ones in Israel, that the particular study that I'm thinking of out of Israel, what they found is that it basically, the people who used the spirulina did not have, many of them had no effect at all, no negative effect from the virus. And a lot of them also had much, much reduced kinds of effects. So negative effects, that is. So it's a tremendous, tremendous thing to keep around. But I would also say that, the best way to use it is on an ongoing basis, because it's not a drug. It doesn't necessarily instantly give you those kinds of results. It has to be put in the body on a regular basis. And so we really advocate ongoing use. But something so simple with no side effects that has many other benefits is hard to come by these days. I mean, we're talking about something that has multiple benefits. So yeah, it does that. It stops that cytokine production, but also because of the anti-inflammatory nature, they've studied it with arthritis and found amazing results with arthritis in animals, of course. Technically we're not allowed to say, well, it worked in an animal, so therefore it works in humans. But we've seen results. Anything related to inflammation seems to be improved with the addition of spirulina. What kind of results each person gets, of course, are different. But the fact is, it's a good thing for reducing inflammation. And we all know that most disease has a component of inflammation, if not the root.
Inflammation is the underlying root cause of almost all chronic disease. And that's something that doctors from all across the board, conventional, functional medicine doctors, all the natural world, scientists, researchers conclude that is one of the biggest factors, underlying root causes of chronic disease is inflammation. So if we can reduce inflammation, anything we could find to help that, it's wise to include that into a daily regimen, like spirulina.
Absolutely. And that's also been found to be great for diabetes because of the blood sugar regulation. And one of the things I want to point out before we leave the immune topic, and there's more we could say about that too, about the phycocyanin, but it's not an immune stimulant in the classic sense, like a drug might stimulate your immune system into action. It's more of a balancing agent. In other words, we've seen people who have immune systems that are, you could say out of control, meaning like a person who has an autoimmune condition actually benefit from the modulation that happens by taking spirulina. And I know there's some people who've recommended, oh, don't take spirulina because they're, afraid that it might make their condition worse. But we know many people who it's made better. Now, of course, that may not be true all across the board. So I would say, first, that we're not prescribing. I'm not prescribing. I'm not a medical doctor. But I would also say, try it and see. Your body will tell you if it's doing you good. If it's not,
sure. I could just tell you from personal experience with my patients with autoimmune diseases that I've never had one who's had any complications by taking spirulina on a regular basis with their autoimmune disease. As a matter of fact, it's really helped to improve their energy and be able to help digestion and a lot of other things. And I think the reason why people who have autoimmune diseases and they are not able to take things like spirulina is because they are not really taking care of their health properly. They're eating the wrong foods. Their immune system is weak. It's actually overreacting with the autoimmune. And so they actually end up having complications sometimes because they're not eating the right foods, they're not living a healthy lifestyle. I think that's part of the problem.
Sure. And then when you throw in like if prescription meds, then it gets even more complicated. And again, I don't mean to say this to say, oh, no, don't take spirulina, because I'm a big proponent of it. I've been taking it since 1981 daily. And but one thing I've seen is that, and this is borne out by studies too. There are studies that show, for example, that spirulina, sometimes people have, they get drug resistant, like with antibiotics. That's a big issue, as you know, Dr. J. And sometimes people get into a situation where they, they don't respond well to, say, an antibiotic. And there are studies that we know of. Again, we can link to them if you like. They're kind of technical, but they've shown that, for example, that taking spirulina actually helps that drug resistance changed for the better, so that they don't, so that they can utilize the antibiotic or whatever it is they're taking.
In other words, you're saying that people who use antibiotics sometimes, that taking it along in tandem with spirulina, that spirulina actually enhances the ability of the antibiotic to kill the bacteria.
Right, which is amazing to me. I mean, I don't know of anything else that does that. There's very, very few situations where people are taking drugs and spirulina isn't going to be a good addition. One of the few is when people are, on chemotherapy. And that is because spirulina is great at getting toxins out of the body. And as we know, chemotherapy is a toxin. So it might be a little counterproductive to do it during the time you're taking the chemo.
Well, actually, Lance, I'd like to hold you studies on spirulina where they actually used spirulina along with chemotherapy, and they found more benefit in the control group that used spirulina with the chemotherapy than the group that didn't and only used chemotherapy by itself. So that's something that I think is quite interesting, that spirulina was able to amplify the benefits of the chemotherapy.
That's amazing and wonderful to hear. And I'm glad you contradicted me there, because what I didn't quite say is that we recommend people do take it, but only in between their rounds. Now, part of that is because we're being ultra cautious.
Sure.
But the truth is, in the studies, and you just said something that's wonderful, which doesn't surprise me in a way. But like I said, we've always gone on the ultra conservative side as far as, recommendations to people, especially when they're dealing with life-threatening. But I will say with radiation, it's the opposite. It is incredibly beneficial for people doing radiation therapy.
Yeah. Well, speaking, since we're on the topic of cancer, there is a study. I'm going to actually read this report here. It was actually in the Journal of Biochemistry and Biophysics Report Journal. This is in 2021, by the way. And the study was actually titled The Antioxidant Effects of Blue-Green Extract on Reactive Oxygen Species Production in Human Lung Cancer. Now, here's what the authors concluded. They said that it was able to inhibit the growth of the cancer cells, but at the same time, it protected the healthy cells. How about that?
That's amazing. And, one of the things it does is it works on the mucosal lining. So whether it's in the gut, whether it's in the lungs, it has a protective effect there too. So it's fantastic for many.
Hold that thought for a second, because I really want to address that particular topic in a minute, but I really want to segue about another study that I found on cancer. And by the way, there's multiple ones. This is another human study, and they found in this particular study that this is for oral cancer, by the way, and they found in this study that with the oral cancer, there was 45% reduction in the oral tumors by using spirulina. Yeah. How about that?
Yeah, it's funny that you brought that up, because that was the next thing I wanted to share, was that if we go back in time to the 1980s, when we were working with our mentor, Dr. Christopher Hills, he actually encouraged and sponsored research at Harvard University where they studied oral cancer. And in their particular studies, and again, these are, they're not hidden, they're available studies. They used hamsters and they gave them cancer. That's what they do when they do animal studies. Unfortunately, it's kind of sad, but on the other hand, we learned a lot from it. They gave them oral cancer with, something really toxic. And then they basically gave them the spirulina extract that our mentor had created. And it's basically, the carotenes, a bunch of them, 17 carotenoids actually, and phycocyanin and a couple other things. And they basically concluded that this eliminated the cancer tumors completely. And it also prevented new ones from forming in the ones that they were, working that way too. So, and I mean, to me, that's just unbelievably positive. And so we've known a little bit about this for a long time. And now, since that time, from the 1980s until now, there have been multiple studies in many different countries concluding the same thing. And yours is another one.
Let me also make another point here, Lance. I recently had a dentist that uses natural approach to dentistry, and she uses a system out of Europe. And she actually was talking about gingivitis, which is the oral microbiome gets disrupted and you get inflammation inside of the gums of the teeth, and you end up with bleeding because of the bacteria breaking down the gums. And spirulina has been shown to be very effective with gingivitis. And from the perspective of the oral microbiome, the bacteria in the mouth, it's the spirulina that's, I believe, transforming the bacteria and feeding the healthy bacteria and getting rid of the bad bacteria. But gingivitis is something that millions of Americans have had at one time in their life. And it's really something that should be done. And you could actually make a mouthwash out of the spirulina and gargle with it. And actually, there's some companies, I believe, that are considering doing that.
That's wonderful. That's great to hear. That's not a study I've seen. Again, it doesn't surprise me, but that's so great to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm happy to hear that. And I know that for me, another thing we could say about all of this stuff, immune system, antiviral, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, all of this contributes to us not just getting sick, on a regular basis. For those of us who've taken spirulina in any significant amount at all on a daily basis, or even close to that, we hardly ever get sick. And I say that about myself, but I know many people who have had the same kind of results.
Mm-hmm. By the way, speaking of, again, you mentioned viruses just a second ago. I just recently came across another study, and I don't have it, but I'll actually put the link to this study I'm going to refer to right now, that in hospitals during the COVID epidemic, they actually took a group of people that had severe COVID, and they put them, one group on spirulina extract, and the other group, they didn't have any at all. And the ones that took the spirulina extract had a significantly less incidence of death compared to the controlled group. And I'll put that study in this link. And it was really dramatic. I mean, there was like, in the one study, there was like 20 deaths during the time that they did the study. And the spirulina group didn't have any deaths. So it was quite dramatic. And so, again, I will put that in the link so people can look at that study.
Great. You know, another thing that's related to the inflammation thing is the allergy reduction. We've, of all the feedback that we get from people on spirulina, that is probably the most common thing that we hear most frequently is people, and they don't, you know, they're usually not expecting it. And sometimes it happens right away. It helps their allergies. Other times it takes a year for people to notice because they all of a sudden they realize, wow, I didn't get my allergies this year like I do every year. And they've told us this over and over and over again, many, many different people. And so it's great for that as well. So there are many, you know, benefits to these things that we don't necessarily think of right off the top of our heads. But it all works together.
No, before I forget, because I certainly will, because we're going to talk about a lot of different things here in this episode. But I have people sometimes object taste of spirulina. It's very dark green, blue green, but it's very dark, and it has kind of like a little bit of a seaweed taste. Although I really should say that your company's spirulina is the most pleasant that I've ever tried in all the years. I've been using spirulina for over 50 years. And yours, when I came across it, I was pleasantly surprised to see how delicious it is. But I have a recipe that I have put together that not only has spirulina in it, but it has alkalizing greens like wheatgrass and barley grass and oatgrass that are fermented. And fermented foods are really good to help to increase the beneficial bacteria inside the gut. Absolutely. So I have these fermented greens in there, along with pomegranate powder and some other superfood powders in there that I mix together with some cinnamon and some other ingredients. And I'll be happy to share that power drink with people. But not only does it help to give you energy, and by the way, I have more energy than China has rice at 75. I play basketball with college students that are 20, and I run full court basketball with them. And I do triathlons. I do sprints. Those are half triathlons. And I work out with weights, and it's hard to keep up with me at 75. And most people that are in their 20s can't keep up with me. And I believe that one of those things that really helps is the spirulina powerhouse drink that I use. And I've given it to multiple people, and they have told me over and over again, as soon as I start using it, I just have tremendous amount of energy, better digestion, better bowel movements. And when I stop using it, I see the difference. So I'll share that in the link as well.
Great. I'm looking forward to trying it myself. It sounds wonderful.
Yeah. So going back to the people with sinusitis and allergies, talk about some of the research and some of the findings that people have experienced with using spirulina.
Well, it's kind of similar to what we talked about before, the cytokine reduction and a few other things that are reduced that are normally associated with inflammation. And of course, many things that we call different diseases like arthritis are really immune related conditions. And so if we can modulate the immune system, If we can get ourselves out of the constant state of inflammation, that alone is probably going to do more good for us than almost anything we can do. And that's one of the things that spirulina does. It's certainly, there are things in it that make a difference between like one spirulina versus another. Like the phycocyanin level is something we like to talk about a lot, because no other company that we know of, they might talk about phycocyanin now. It's becoming popular to talk about it because they're realizing that it's important. But we've never seen any company that comes close to what we offer, which is minimum 20% phycocyanin content. And we don't put any spirulina out to market that has any less than that. So when you buy New Phoenix Rising Biolumina Spirulina, we call it, you're getting minimum 20% phycocyanin, and we've seen it go as high as just under 25%, which, you know, there are lots of spirulina gurus out there on the internet who don't even know that's possible, much less where to get it. So that's one of the reasons why it tastes better. You notice that too. Many people say, "Oh gosh, this smells much better than other spirulina I've taken," and there are reasons for that too that are different.
Well, speaking of which, I also want to talk about the texture and the ability to mix it. I know over the years when I've used spirulina, I've often found that when you mix it with water or any juice or anything, it clumps. Mm-hmm. And with this new Phoenix Rising Spirulina, it doesn't clump, and it just mixes up very well. And I truly believe, and I've actually seen some companies that put things like rice to cut the spirulina so that they can extend the quantity of the spirulina. And that, I believe, is the reason why it clumps, because there's things like rice in it. And this doesn't clump at all. And that is a very pleasant thing to be able to, when you're drinking it, you don't get it stuck to your teeth, and it doesn't really, have that grittiness to it. So it's really delicious, and it's smooth, and it does make a big difference, by the way.
You know, that's a really good point. And I'll tell a quick little story, which was way back when our mentor first launched the company that we became a part of back in we joined it in 1981. It launched at the end of 79. But at that time, there were only two companies marketing spirulina in the US. And what happened was, within a few months of the launch of that company that we were associated with, the National Enquirer, I don't know if you remember that magazine, they did an article and they called spirulina a safe diet pill. It was a big headline, right on the front. We have an original copy of it. That article just made people go crazy about spirulina. And the company that we were associated with, in their first 8 months of business, they sold $80 million worth of spirulina. It was amazing. But what happened was, all these other people said, "Oh my goodness, we need to get in on this." Within 6 months, there were, I don't remember the total number of companies, but I know it was like 50 or more companies in business selling it. And our mentor, Christopher Hills, was a bit disgusted with this, because he knew he understood the worldwide supply of spirulina. It was very limited at that point. So he knew something was fishy going on there. So he had, I think, 40 different brands analyzed at an FDA approved lab in Los Angeles. Shankman Labs was the name of the company, of the laboratory. And they found that a very high percentage, like 80% of them, had no spirulina detected. All of these products said 100% spirulina. And the other 20%, they had varying degree levels of spirulina mixed with other ingredients. And of course, Christopher took this to the FDA and said, "Hey, look at this. What are you going to do about this?" And they said, "Well, nobody's died yet, so we're not going to do anything about it." Hopefully our FDA is going to get a little better.
Oh yeah, this is an exciting time with RF Kennedy coming on board and really making some big changes. But we'll talk a little bit that maybe later. But I want to talk about the way that you guys at your company produce this, and let's talk a little bit about that, because the heat and the sunlight is
Yeah.
all so important. Talk a little bit about that whole milieu.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important point. Spirulina is a bunch of pigments. It has many things in it, but pigments are super important. Phycocyanin is one, chlorella is another, beta carotene. There are numerous pigments in there, but it's the light, the sunlight, the interaction with the sunlight and the chemicals that create these various pigments. And one of the ones that we focus on a lot, as we said before, is phycocyanin, because it has so much potential for so much healing, including things we haven't mentioned yet. But we know this. We've known this for a long time. So we, like I said before, we market a high level of phycocyanin. Now, the spirulina there are only so many spirulina farms in the world, and we're aware of almost all of them. There may be one or two that we haven't heard about yet, the small ones. But there are farms in Asia, in Africa, in the US. But most of these farms, spirulina grows best in a warmer climate. Most of the farms are in tropical areas. Now, one of the secrets to growing high phycocyanin spirulina is the heat. It's not the only thing, but it's a prerequisite. You've got to have enough heat in order to grow those levels of phycocyanin. So where we grow ours in the desert, in a very remote, pristine area in Southern California, but way east of San Diego, way out in the desert, it regularly in the summertime gets to be air temperature 110 to 130 degrees.
Wow.
I mean, this is really hot. And you might think, oh my gosh, what would grow there? Well, spirulina loves it. In fact, that's one of the beauties of it. You're not using farmland that could be used for something else, pretty much. I mean, yeah, you could grow some cactus or something, but spirulina grows almost where nothing else will grow. And that's one of the beauties of it, is that it's not only good for people, but it's actually good for the environment too. We can talk a little bit about that and the hunger thing too. But back to the phycocyanin, you've got to have the heat to get the higher level. So most companies don't talk about it too much. They say it's got phycocyanin in it, it's a great thing. Well, that's true. But when you're talking about levels 5%, 6%, 7%, even 10%, there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean the spirulina is bad. It's just not premium. It's not 20 to 25%. And if you go look at, phycocyanin used to cost about $800 a pound. It's come down a bit now on the wholesale market. It's less, but it's expensive stuff. I mean, if you take the phycocyanin that's in one unit of our spirulina and you bought it separately, you pay more than you're paying for the whole, 400 grams of spirulina. And even now that the prices come down, because there's more people extracting it. The thing is, it costs money to extract it. It's a funny thing. People in business want to have something that's unique, of course, that nobody else has. Well, spirulina, a lot of people, anybody who can grow it can have it. But it takes some expertise to grow it well. And that's the thing that we do. We know how to do that. We know how to grow it really well. And so you're not going to get mediocre spirulina. It's going to taste better. And there's reasons for that too. And I can go into that I don't think we talked about that last time.
Please go ahead.
So one of the things that happened is we like to say our spirulina is beyond organic. And here's what we mean by that. A few years ago, the US government decided that one of the ingredients that we use to grow we've been organic certified for decades, right? But then they made this change in the law and they said, okay, you can't use, this is Chilean nitrate. It's a wonderful, sterile, it's harvested from a sterile desert in South America. It's sustainably harvested and it's wonderful stuff. The problem with it is if you use it in organic or any kind of agriculture, you can put too much nitrogen in the soil and create problems with that. So the US government in all of its wisdom said, okay, if you use that, you can't call it organic. And they said this is true for organic agriculture, which was fine, except that they applied it to aquaculture too. They did a one-size-fits-all thing. Well, when we grow spirulina, it has nothing to do with the soil. We don't grow it in the soil. We grow it in lined ponds. So the problems that happen with that substance in agriculture are non-existent in what we're doing. And yet, if we want to use that, then we cannot call our spirulina organic. So a lot of the farms said, well, we're not going to do that anymore because, we want to keep our organic certification. Well, they had to find a replacement ingredient. So that's the tricky part. So what did they do? They started using like animal blood and things like that instead. And there's some problems with that. One is it makes the spirulina stinky, for lack of a better word. And another is that you introduce the possibility of genetically modified organisms. Where did that blood come from? What were those animals eating? You introduce the possibility of more pathogens in the growing medium. You introduce the idea of, is this really vegetarian? I mean, there's layers of issues that come up. Our farm, we decided, you know what? This is more of a political thing than a science thing. It's not a good idea. It's not safe. So we said we're giving up our organic certification in order to provide a better product. So we're still organic, just like we always were, but we're not certified anymore. We have every other kind of certification you can think of.
Okay, well, I've got a question though, because you're just talking about this Chilean nitrogen, which you has said is very beneficial. Yeah. But that concerns me if you're just focusing on the nitrogen and you're missing, a whole food complex to feed the soil, to feed the medium, to feed the water.
Right.
What are you doing to be able to make sure it's balanced?
Oh, absolutely. Good question. Yeah, there's many different nutrients that are in the water. First of all, the water is triple filtered before it even starts.
Are you supplementing it with nitrogen and something else is what I want to know.
Yes, there are other things put into the water, minerals, other things like that. And the other thing to know is that the water itself has to be extremely alkaline. Spirulina won't grow. It only grows in a very, in fact, it's so alkaline that nothing else will grow in it. That's one of the reasons why, if you're growing the spirulina properly, the issues of the neurotoxins and things like that are associated with another blue-green algae whose abbreviation is AFA. Sorry, I'm jumping all over the map here. But those problems don't exist because the environment itself won't allow those things to live in there. That's one of the beautiful things about spirulina. But yes, we are adding other things into the water. I don't have a complete list of those ingredients in front of you right now.
Well, you brought up the AFA algae. Mm-hmm. Talk about that, because I know that there are concerns and people associate all spirulina with that one, and I want you to differentiate and let people know the difference.
Sure, that's a really good question, because there's a lot of stuff on the internet about, they talk about spirulina, but they're really talking about AFA. First of all, AFA is not spirulina. It is not a type of spirulina. It's a completely different organism. And it grows in Klamath Lake, Oregon. And it has been known to both harbor other organisms that are neurotoxins and also emit its own neurotoxin. And these things happen in a way that is not real predictable. So the only way to know for sure is this a toxic batch is to do a very expensive testing. Or
so just for our listening audience benefits, the spirulina that you produce, it's in this particular one that you're talking about right now.
Right, which a lot of people confuse. It's absolutely not in ours. But people are so confused about it, even sometimes doctors and scientists, that we actually test for it daily, even though we don't need to. We do that just to put people's mind at ease. It's a kind of a strange thing. It's become this sort of buzz thing on the internet for people who are following that. I mean, not everybody does, but the point is that we've never ever had anything like that in our spirulina, and I would venture to say we never will. But nonetheless, it's great that we test for it anyway, I think, because what the heck, this way we can tell you with absolute certainty. And we do that with heavy metals too. Every 10 days we test for heavy metals. Spirulina is an interesting crop. Once it starts in little tiny vats inside of a production facility indoors, and then it moves into these small ponds where it gets to a certain level, and then it moves into the big ponds. And then once it gets going in the big ponds, you can harvest a new crop every 3 days. I mean, it's amazing. When you think about exposure to other toxins, like chemicals in the air, all crops have some exposure to that kind of toxin, no matter where you are, because we know there's chemicals in the air that don't stop at the boundary of one state. They don't stop because, you've decided this is going to be pristine. They just go wherever they go where the air currents take them. So you've got that issue going on. Well, most food that you eat is exposed to months of airborne contaminants. We're talking every 3 days here, we have a new crop. So it has the least exposure of any food that we know of, because nothing grows in 3 days like spirulina does. Maybe another algae might. So that's one of the reasons why it's such a fantastic food in terms of feeding people. Like you said at the beginning, there's no other food that is as nutrient dense as spirulina. And I would venture to add that there's also no other, well, I wouldn't say no other, but almost no other foods that have the broad spectrum of nutrients that spirulina has in it. I could think of one other that we could compete. Do you want to know what that is?
Yeah, please.
Mother's milk.
Wonderful.
Yeah. But most of us don't have access for very long to mother's milk. So we can eat spirulina since we don't have the mother's milk access.
Yeah,
but
well, actually, I know that scientists are looking at using spirulina as a world food source for people who are starving, and it's just that beneficial. And many people have looked at it, and there just needs to be more movement in that direction to be able to provide this wonderful food source for people who are starving.
Absolutely. I mean, right now there's enough spirulina just going to waste in Africa, for example, that could literally keep the whole continent alive. In the Rift Valley in Ethiopia, some of the best spirulina in the world naturally grows there. And it's just, really just sitting there growing. It's kind of a shame. Spirulina not only is good for people, but it's good for the environment too. It produces tremendous amount of oxygen just by growing. It uses less water per pound of protein than any other protein source, much less than like animals, even ones that are raised responsibly, much less than crops like soybeans. I mean, it's very efficient. You think, well, it's growing in water, it must use a lot of water. Well, actually, it uses less water than you use in just about any other crop. It also can recycle toxins very well. Of course, you don't want to eat spirulina that's been recycling toxins, but nonetheless, it's good for the environment. And like I mentioned to you, we have a scientist who's right now working on a plan for changing, or I should say stabilizing the whole Earth environment just by, he's calculating how many square miles of spirulina ponds it would take to do that. And it's actually, turns out it's not really big. It's about the size of a small country, but it would be spread all over the world. And the cost of doing it is like nothing compared to some of the other things that have been proposed. So there's so many things with spirulina. It's amazing.
Yeah,
we should talk about more health benefits.
I want to shift back to the health benefits, and I want to talk about, we talked about the blue-green algae that some people are actually buying. Unfortunately, that is AFA, and it's not the brand that you sell at all. But this, and by the way, that brand is neurotoxic, but the spirulina that you grow has neuroprotective properties. Yeah. Talk about that.
Thank you. That's a great thing. There was some research on Parkinson's recently, and again, back to the phycocyanin. That's what they researched, and they found that it had very promising effects on that condition. It's preliminary. We don't have volumes of research on that particular condition, but it points to the fact that, and there are other studies showing its neuroprotective abilities besides, the one I'm thinking of for Parkinson's, but they're more generalized. They're not specific to a particular disease or condition. But I mean, when you think about the body, and the gut-brain connection, the whole thing is the gut and the brain are communicating. The brain's sending these signals. When the gut gets out of balance, it sends the wrong signals to the brain. The brain then sends the wrong signals to the rest of the body. The body does whatever it's told, basically. But if the brain's telling it, oh yeah, you should develop cancer over here, then that's what's going to happen. So when we protect our neuro pathways, very, very fundamental to health, because that's where the signals, that's how they get transmitted. That's how the information is passed.
Sure. Now, so you mentioned this is interesting because you just mentioned the gut-brain axis, the communication between the brain and the gut, the crosstalk that goes on. Now, moving into the gut, we alluded to this earlier. We didn't really dive into it, but let's talk about how spirulina is able to help the mucus lining of the gut, which gets damaged and then causes leaky gut, which then allows toxins, since we're talking about toxins, to get in the bloodstream. And then that goes throughout the entire body, depositing in different areas and causing disease. So talk about the protective mechanisms that are built within the phytochemicals in spirulina that protects the mucus lining of the gut.
So there's many, many things going on here too. And one of them is, jumping around again a bit here, but the neuro, a little bit more on the neuroprotective ability. One study was shown that the toxicity of iron, which can happen when the body